Marcus Rivera had no idea that the elegantly dressed woman who stopped to help him change his flat tire in the hospital parking lot at 2 a.m. was Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of the most renowned pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country, and heir to a medical dynasty worth over $200 million. With nothing more than a grateful handshake and a tired smile, he accepted her offer to help hold the flashlight while he worked on his battered 2008 Honda Civic, completely unaware that this chance encounter would not only save his 8-year-old daughter Sofia's life, but transform his family's entire future in ways he never dared to imagine possible. The fluorescent lights of Children's Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows across the nearly empty parking lot as Marcus struggled with the lug nuts on his front tire, his hands trembling not from the cold October air, but from the devastating news he'd received just hours earlier. His daughter Sofia, the bright-eyed little girl who had been his entire world since his wife Maria's death 3 years ago, needed immediate open-heart surgery to repair a congenital defect that had suddenly become life-threatening. The estimated cost was $127,000, and despite his military insurance covering a portion, he was still facing nearly $60,000 in out-of-pocket expenses that might as well have been $60 million for all his ability to pay. At 34, Marcus carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much too young, his broad shoulders bearing invisible weight that went far beyond his current financial crisis. The Marine Corps had taught him to face impossible odds with determination, but nothing in his 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan had prepared him for the helpless feeling of watching his daughter struggle to breathe while knowing he couldn't afford the surgery that could save her life. His dark hair, prematurely touched with gray at the temples, caught the parking lot lights as he worked, and the small scar above his left eyebrow served as a permanent reminder of the roadside bomb that had ended his military career and left him with a slight limp that became more pronounced when he was tired or stressed. The Honda Civic that had betrayed him with its flat tire was a testament to his current circumstances, its faded blue paint and rust spots telling the story of a man who had learned to make do with less while trying to provide stability for his daughter. The back seat was scattered with Sofia's schoolbooks, a worn stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts that had belonged to her mother, and the small pharmacy of medications that had become part of their daily routine as her condition worsened. In the front seat, a stack of medical bills and insurance paperwork created a paper mountain of bureaucratic complexity that seemed to grow larger every day, each form representing another barrier between Sofia and the treatment she desperately needed. Marcus had spent the evening in the hospital's financial counselor's office, going through every possible option for funding Sofia's surgery with the methodical precision he'd once applied to mission planning in the Marines. Payment plans that would stretch for decades, medical credit cards with interest rates that bordered on predatory, charity care applications that required documentation he didn't have, and loan programs that demanded collateral he didn't possess, had all been discussed and ultimately dismissed as inadequate for his situation. The counselor, a kind woman named Patricia Chun, who had clearly delivered similar news to countless other desperate parents, had spoken with professional compassion about the hospital's inability to perform the surgery without guarantee of payment. Her words echoing in Marcus's mind like artillery fire in the distance. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on Marcus as he knelt on the cold asphalt beside his disabled car in the shadow of one of the country's premier pediatric hospitals. He had served his country with distinction, earning a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for valor during his final deployment, but the same government that had honored his service now provided benefits that fell short of covering his daughter's medical needs. The VA disability payments that supplemented his income from his job at Morrison Construction were calculated with bureaucratic precision that took no account of 8-year-old girls who needed their hearts repaired by the best surgeons money could buy. His monthly budget, carefully maintained in a composition notebook that lived in his kitchen drawer, showed income and expenses balanced to the penny with no room for unexpected catastrophes that cost more than most people's annual salary. The construction job that provided their primary income was honest work that Marcus approached with the same dedication he'd brought to military service. But it was also physically demanding labor that his war-injured body absorbed like punishment for surviving when others hadn't. His supervisor, Tommy Castellanos, had been understanding about the medical appointments and modified duties when Marcus's leg bothered him. But construction sites didn't offer the kind of health insurance that covered experimental pediatric cardiac procedures or the flexibility that single parenthood sometimes required. Marcus had missed work 3 times in the past month for Sofia's medical consultations, each absence representing lost wages that made their financial situation increasingly precarious even before the surgery estimate had arrived like a financial death sentence. Sofia Elena Rivera, named for both her maternal grandmother and the patron saint of wisdom, had inherited her mother's bright smile and her father's quiet determination, but she had also inherited a genetic condition that neither parent had known they carried until it was too late to do anything but fight. At 8 years old, she approached her medical challenges with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that she brought to math homework and soccer practice, never complaining about the medications that made her tired or the activity restrictions that kept her on the sidelines while other children ran and played without thinking about their hearts. Her drawings, which covered every available surface in their small apartment, often featured families of elephants because Mr. Peanuts had taught her that elephants never forgot the people they loved, a lesson that had become increasingly important. As her memories of her mother began to fade, the small apartment they shared in the Riverside Heights complex was a study in making the most of limited space and resources, every corner optimized for functionality while maintaining the warmth that Sofia needed to feel secure in a world that had already taken too much from her young life. Marcus had painted the walls himself in colors that Sofia had chosen, soft yellows and gentle greens that made their modest space feel larger and more cheerful than the cramped quarters suggested. The furniture was a mixture of garage sale finds and military surplus, pieces that had been chosen for durability rather than style, but that somehow created a home that felt stable and loved despite its obvious limitations. In the kitchen, a bulletin board displayed Sofia's school pictures alongside Marcus's military commendations and a handful of crayon drawings that depicted their family of 2 as happy stick figures, holding hands under impossibly blue skies. Medical crisis that had brought them to this breaking point had developed gradually over the past 6 months, beginning with Sofia's complaints about feeling tired during gym class and escalating through a series of increasingly urgent cardiology appointments that had revealed the progressive nature of her condition. Dr. Amanda Foster, Sofia's pediatric cardiologist, had explained the situation with the kind of clinical precision that medical professionals used to deliver life-altering news, her words carefully chosen to convey both the urgency of Sofia's condition and the complexity of the surgical intervention required to address it. The defect in Sofia's heart was becoming more severe as she grew, and without surgical repair, her activity would become increasingly limited until even simple tasks, like climbing stairs or playing on the playground, would become dangerous too. Her health. Marcus had approached Sofia's medical care with the same systematic thoroughness he'd applied to everything important in his life, researching her condition online until he understood the terminology and treatment options as well as any layperson could hope to achieve. He'd sought second opinions from other cardiologists, explored clinical trial opportunities, and investigated medical tourism options that might provide the same level of care at reduced cost. But every path he'd explored had led back to the same conclusion that Sofia needed surgery from a highly skilled pediatric cardiac surgeon at a facility equipped to handle the complexity of her particular case. Children's Memorial Hospital had the best outcomes for cases like Sofia's, but their excellence came with a price tag that reflected both their expertise and their equipment costs. The insurance maze that Marcus had been navigating for months was a bureaucratic labyrinth designed to confuse and delay rather than provide clear answers about coverage and benefits. His military insurance covered basic medical care but classified Sofia's surgery as elective despite its life-saving necessity, a designation that seemed to exist primarily to limit financial liability rather than reflect medical reality. Appeals and prior authorization requests had consumed countless hours of his time and generated stacks of paperwork that documented his persistence while providing no additional coverage for Sofia's needs. The insurance company's customer service representatives spoke in scripted responses that acknowledged his frustration while offering no solutions, beyond suggesting payment plans that would extend their financial obligations well into Sofia's adulthood. The evening's consultation with the hospital's financial team had been Marcus's last hope for finding a viable path forward, and the crushing reality of their final assessment had left him feeling more defeated than he'd felt since the day Maria died. Patricia Chun had worked through every available option with professional thoroughness, her computer screen displaying calculations that quantified his family's desperate situation in columns of numbers that never quite added up to hope. Charity care programs had waiting lists that extended beyond Sofia's safe treatment window. Medical loans required credit scores that Marcus's post-military financial struggles had damaged, and payment plans that the hospital could offer still required down payments that exceeded his annual savings by orders of magnitude. The parking lot, where Marcus now struggled with his flat tire, was nearly empty except for a few cars belonging to night shift medical staff and a handful of family members who maintained bedside vigils in the hospital's intensive care units. The October air carried the promise of winter, and Marcus could see his breath as he worked, the physical discomfort of kneeling on cold asphalt providing a welcome distraction from the emotional weight of the impossible choices he was facing. His military training had taught him to focus on immediate tactical problems when strategic solutions seemed impossible. And right now the immediate problem was getting his car operational so he could drive home to Sofia, who was staying with Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment next door, and probably wondering why her father was so late returning from what should have been a routine consultation. The tire iron that came with the Honda was barely adequate for the task at hand, its leverage insufficient for lug nuts that had been installed with pneumatic tools and tightened by 3 years of regular use. Marcus's injured leg sent sharp protests up his spine each time he had to reposition himself to get better leverage, reminding him of the limitations that made physical labor increasingly difficult as he aged and his war injuries accumulated, like compound interest on a debt he could never fully repay. The irony of struggling with automotive problems outside a hospital where his daughter couldn't receive treatment because of financial problems wasn't lost on him, and he found himself wondering if this was how his life would always be, one crisis compounding another until even simple tasks became insurmountable obstacles. The sound of approaching footsteps on the asphalt behind him caused Marcus to look up from his work, expecting to see a security guard or perhaps another parent dealing with their own family medical crisis. Instead, he saw a woman in her early 40s approaching with confident strides, her professional attire and composed demeanor suggesting someone who belonged in boardrooms rather than hospital parking lots at 2 in the morning. She was elegantly dressed in a tailored dark coat that spoke of quality and attention to detail, her appearance immaculate despite the late hour and the less than ideal setting for a chance encounter between strangers. Marcus had grown up in the small border town of Del Rio, Texas, where his father Roberto had worked double shifts at the meatpacking plant and his mother Carmen had cleaned houses for wealthy families on the north side of town, both parents sacrificing their own dreams to ensure their children could reach for something better. The Rivera family had lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, where the sound of trains carrying freight to distant cities provided a constant reminder that there was a world beyond the dusty streets and limited opportunities of their hometown. Roberto Rivera had served briefly in Vietnam before returning home to marry his high school sweetheart and settle into the steady rhythm of working-class life. His military service earning him respect in the community, but providing few tangible benefits beyond the stories he would tell Marcus about the importance of honor, duty, and taking care of your family no matter what the cost. Carmen Rivera had possessed the kind of quiet strength that held families together during difficult times. Her faith in God and her belief in education serving as the foundation for every decision she made regarding her children's futures. She had worked for the Patterson family for 12 years, cleaning their sprawling ranch house and caring for their children, while her own son came home to an empty house and did his homework at the kitchen table, surrounded by the smell of the dinner she was preparing between her afternoon and evening cleaning jobs. The Pattersons had been kind employers who appreciated Carmen's reliability and attention to detail, often giving her their children's outgrown clothes and leftover food that stretched the Rivera family budget just enough to cover unexpected expenses like school supplies or Marcus's participation in youth football. Education had been the central focus of Marcus's childhood, with both parents making it clear that academic achievement was not optional, but rather the pathway to a life that offered more choices than they had been given. Carmen had attended every parent-teacher conference and school function despite her work schedule, her presence at Marcus's football games and academic awards ceremonies, serving as visible proof of her priorities and her belief in his potential. Roberto had worked extra shifts to pay for Marcus's football equipment and had spent countless hours in the backyard teaching his son the discipline and work ethic that would carry him through the challenges that lay ahead. His own unfulfilled dreams of military service finding expression in the pride he took in Marcus's developing character and physical capabilities. High school had revealed Marcus's natural leadership abilities and his talent for bringing out the best in his teammates, qualities that earned him respect from both his coaches and his peers while preparing him for the responsibilities he would later assume in military service. His grades had been consistently above average without being exceptional, but his character and his dedication to improvement had caught the attention of college recruiters who saw potential that transcended test scores and statistics. The football scholarship to Texas A&M had represented not just an opportunity for Marcus, but a validation of his parents' sacrifices and their faith in the American dream, that hard work and determination could overcome economic circumstances and family background. College had been Marcus's first real exposure to people from different backgrounds, and his first taste of the wider world that existed beyond the border towns of South Texas, experiences that broadened his perspective while reinforcing the values his parents had instilled through their example rather than their lectures. His teammates had come from suburban high schools with resources that dwarfed anything he had experienced, but Marcus's work ethic and his natural ability to motivate others had earned him a starting position by his sophomore year and the respect of coaches who valued character as much as athletic ability. The engineering program had challenged him academically in ways that high school had not, requiring study habits and time management, skills that he developed through trial and error while maintaining his athletic commitments and his part-time job in the university's maintenance department. The decision to join the Marines after graduation had been influenced by his father's military stories and his own desire to serve something larger than himself. But it had also been driven by practical considerations about student loan debt and the limited job prospects for new engineering graduates during the economic recession that had begun during his senior year. The Marines had offered not just a career, but a sense of purpose that aligned with the values his parents had taught him about duty, sacrifice, and the importance of protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. The officer candidate school at Quantico had tested his physical and mental limits in ways that college football had not, breaking him down and rebuilding him into someone capable of making life and death decisions under pressure, while maintaining the moral clarity necessary to lead others in combat situations. His first deployment to Afghanistan had come 18 months after his commissioning, when he was 24 years old and convinced that his training had prepared him for whatever challenges he might face in a combat environment. The reality of counterinsurgency warfare had proven more complex and morally ambiguous than anything he had studied in military science courses, requiring split-second decisions that balanced force protection against civilian casualties while pursuing objectives that often seemed to shift based on political considerations beyond his understanding or control. The Marines under his command had been young men mostly from backgrounds similar to his own, small-town kids looking for direction and opportunity, who had found both in the Corps, but who were now facing dangers that no amount of training could fully prepare them to handle. The first firefight had occurred during his third week in country, when his platoon had been conducting a routine patrol through a village where intelligence suggested Taliban fighters were planning an attack on a nearby coalition base. The ambush had come from multiple directions simultaneously, with enemy fighters using civilian buildings for cover and concealment, while Marcus and his Marines had been forced to return fire while trying to minimize casualties among the villagers who were caught in the crossfire. The action had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it had taught Marcus lessons about leadership, fear, and moral complexity that no training exercise could have provided, showing him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather the ability to function effectively despite being terrified. His Marines had performed with the kind of disciplined professionalism that made him proud to wear the uniform, but the aftermath of the firefight had revealed the psychological toll that combat extracted from even the most well-trained and mentally prepared young men. Corporal Davidson, barely 19 years old and homesick for his family's farm in Iowa, had struggled with nightmares and anxiety that required careful management and counseling that wasn't always available in forward operating bases where mental health resources were limited. Lance Corporal Martinez, whose sense of humor had kept morale high during the long hours of patrol preparation, had become withdrawn and hypervigilant after the firefight, jumping at unexpected sounds and requiring reassurance that took time and attention that Marcus was still learning how to provide. The second deployment had been more intense than the first, with his unit assigned to a region where Taliban activity had increased and where the rules of engagement seemed to change weekly based on political considerations that filtered down through the chain of command like distorted echoes of decisions made in Washington by people who had never experienced the reality of combat operations. Marcus had been promoted to captain and given responsibility for a larger unit, his leadership abilities recognized by superiors who valued his ability to maintain unit cohesion while accomplishing missions that often required cultural sensitivity as much as military tactics. The additional responsibility had come with additional stress, as he now bore accountability for the safety and effectiveness of more Marines while operating in an environment where small mistakes could have strategic consequences. The relationship with Maria had begun during his leave between his second and third deployments, when he had been stationed at Camp Pendleton and she had been finishing her nursing degree at San Diego State University. They had met at a coffee shop near the university where Marcus had been studying for his captain's promotion board examination, and Maria's combination of intelligence, compassion, and strength had immediately attracted him in ways that went beyond physical attraction to encompass admiration for her character and her commitment to helping others through her chosen profession. Their courtship had been compressed by the realities of military service, with the knowledge that his upcoming deployment would separate them for at least a year, adding urgency to their growing relationship and forcing them to make decisions about their future together more quickly than either might have preferred under different circumstances. Maria Elena Santos had grown up in a Mexican-American family in East Los Angeles, where her father had worked as a mechanic and her mother had been a seamstress who took in additional work to help pay for her children's education and extracurricular activities. Her decision to pursue nursing had been motivated by her desire to help people and her recognition that healthcare provided both stable employment and opportunities to make a meaningful difference in people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. Her family had initially been concerned about her relationship with a Marine who would face regular deployments and the dangers of combat service. But Marcus's respectful treatment of Maria and his obvious devotion to her had gradually won over her parents and siblings, who came to see him as a worthy addition to their close-knit family. The wedding had taken place during Marcus's pre-deployment leave, a small ceremony in Maria's family church with reception at the parish hall where her extended family had celebrated weddings and baptisms for 3 generations. Marcus's parents had driven from Texas to attend, their pride in their son's military service and their genuine affection for Maria evident in the speeches Roberto had given and the tears Carmen had shed while dancing with her new daughter-in-law. The marriage had represented not just the union of 2 individuals, but the joining of 2 families who shared values about hard work, faith, and the importance of supporting each other through whatever challenges life might present, creating a foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment that would prove essential during the difficult times that lay ahead. The 3rd deployment had been the most dangerous and psychologically demanding of Marcus's military career, with his unit assigned to a region where improvised explosive devices were the primary threat and where every patrol carried the possibility of catastrophic casualties that could devastate unit morale, while accomplishing objectives that often seemed disconnected from any larger strategic purpose. The constant stress of hypervigilance had worn on everyone in the unit, with sleep deprivation and combat stress creating conditions where small incidents could escalate into major problems requiring careful management and intervention from leaders who were themselves struggling with the same psychological pressures as their subordinates. Marcus had learned to recognize the signs of combat stress in his Marines while managing his own anxiety and fear, developing coping mechanisms that allowed him to maintain the appearance of confidence and control that his leadership position required. The roadside bomb that ended his military career had exploded during what should have been a routine supply convoy, sending shrapnel through the door of his armored vehicle and into his left leg while concussing him severely enough to require evacuation to a military hospital in Germany. The physical injuries had been treatable with surgery and rehabilitation, but the traumatic brain injury had created cognitive challenges that made continued military service impossible despite his desire to return to his unit and complete his tour of duty. The medical discharge had been accompanied by disability ratings and benefits that acknowledged his service-connected injuries, while providing compensation that fell short of replacing the career he had planned to pursue until retirement. Medical discharge from the Marines had thrust Marcus into civilian life with little preparation for the transition, leaving him adrift in a world that seemed to move at a different pace and operate by unfamiliar rules that bore no resemblance to the clear chain of command and defined objectives that had structured his adult life for nearly a decade. The Veterans Administration had provided disability payments, calculated with bureaucratic precision, that took no account of the emotional cost of losing a career that had defined his identity and purpose, the monthly checks arriving with mechanical regularity while offering no replacement for the sense of mission and brotherhood that had made military service more than just a job. The physical therapy appointments and medical evaluations had consumed months of his time while providing incremental improvements to his mobility that fell short of returning him to the level of physical capability he had enjoyed before the roadside bomb had reorganized his spine and scattered metal fragments throughout his left leg. Maria had been working as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Orange County when Marcus returned from his final deployment, her career providing both financial stability and emotional fulfillment, while he struggled with the transition to civilian life and the search for employment that could accommodate his physical limitations while providing the intellectual challenge and sense of purpose he needed to maintain his mental health. Her patience and understanding during his darkest months had been anchored in her professional experience with trauma recovery and her deep faith in their ability to build a meaningful life together despite the challenges that his injuries and career change had created for their future plans. The small apartment they had shared near the hospital had become a sanctuary where Marcus could process his experiences and gradually develop the civilian identity that would replace his military persona. Maria's presence providing stability and encouragement when his own motivation faltered. The pregnancy had been unexpected, but welcomed with joy that transcended their concerns about timing and financial preparedness, both of them seeing Sofia's impending arrival as an opportunity to focus on creation and hope rather than dwelling on the losses and disappointments that had marked the early years of their marriage. Maria's pregnancy had progressed without complications, her medical training allowing her to monitor her own health while preparing for motherhood with the systematic thoroughness she brought to every important endeavor. Marcus had thrown himself into pregnancy preparation with the same attention to detail he had once applied to mission planning, reading parenting books and assembling nursery furniture while trying to imagine himself as a father responsible for shaping another human being's development and character. Sofia's birth had been the defining moment of Marcus's transition to civilian life, her arrival transforming abstract concepts about fatherhood into immediate responsibilities that required skills he had never needed in military service but felt naturally equipped to handle through some combination of instinct and preparation. The first time he had held his daughter in the hospital room where Maria was recovering from delivery, Marcus had experienced a sense of purpose and protective responsibility that rivaled anything he had felt during his most dangerous combat operations. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, creating a bond that immediately reorganized his priorities and gave new meaning to concepts like courage and sacrifice. The sleepless nights and endless diaper changes that followed had tested his endurance in ways that military training had not. But the rewards of watching Sofia develop her personality and begin to interact with the world around her had provided satisfaction that made the challenges seem insignificant. The job search that had dominated Marcus's first months as a father had been complicated by his desire to find work that could accommodate his physical limitations while providing sufficient income to support his growing family and maintain the health insurance coverage that Maria's maternity leave had temporarily disrupted. The construction industry had offered opportunities for someone with his engineering background and his ability to read blueprints and understand structural systems, but the physical demands of job site work had aggravated his leg injury in ways that required careful management and modification of his duties to prevent further damage. Morrison Construction had been willing to hire him based on his military experience and his technical knowledge, offering a starting wage that was modest but adequate for their needs, while providing the kind of health insurance coverage that young families required to protect against unexpected medical expenses. Tommy Castellanos, the project foreman who had become Marcus's immediate supervisor, was a second-generation construction worker whose family had built their reputation on quality craftsmanship and fair treatment of their employees, values that made Morrison Construction one of the more desirable employers in an industry known for dangerous working conditions and unstable employment patterns. Tommy's own father had served in Vietnam and had struggled with similar challenges adjusting to civilian employment, experiences that made him sympathetic to Marcus's situation, while maintaining the performance standards necessary to keep projects on schedule and within budget. The work itself had been physically demanding but intellectually engaging, requiring problem-solving skills and attention to detail that reminded Marcus of the best aspects of military service while allowing him to see tangible results from his efforts in the form of completed buildings and satisfied customers. The early years of Sofia's life had been marked by the kind of ordinary happiness that Marcus had dreamed about during his deployments. Routine days filled with work, family time, and the simple pleasures of watching his daughter discover the world around her through exploration and play that required constant supervision but provided endless entertainment. Maria had returned to her nursing position when Sofia was 6 months old. Their schedules coordinated to minimize childcare costs, while ensuring that Sofia always had at least one parent available for feeding, naps, and the countless small crises that seemed to emerge without warning in households with young children. The financial strain of supporting a family on Marcus's construction wages and Maria's part-time nursing salary had required careful budgeting and occasional sacrifices, but their shared commitment to providing Sofia with a stable and loving home had made the challenges seem manageable rather than overwhelming. The diagnosis that would eventually reshape their family's trajectory had first appeared when Sofia was 18 months old, initially manifesting as unusual fatigue during activities that other toddlers handled without difficulty. Symptoms so subtle that Marcus and Maria had initially attributed them to normal variations in childhood development rather than signs of an underlying medical condition. Dr. Patricia Morrison, Sofia's pediatrician, had been thorough in her evaluation, but cautious about ordering expensive diagnostic tests for symptoms that could have multiple explanations. Her approach reflecting both medical prudence and awareness of the financial pressures that young families faced when dealing with health insurance deductibles and copayments. The echocardiogram that had finally revealed Sofia's heart defect had been scheduled almost as an afterthought, a precautionary measure to rule out cardiac causes for her exercise intolerance, rather than a test that anyone expected to reveal a serious underlying condition. The congenital heart defect that Sofia had inherited was a complex anomaly that involved multiple chambers and valves, a condition that occurred in fewer than 1 in 10,000 births, and that required surgical intervention that was both technically challenging and extremely expensive even when performed by the most skilled pediatric cardiac surgeons available. The genetic counseling session that had followed Sofia's diagnosis had revealed that both Marcus and Maria were carriers for the recessive genes that had combined to create their daughter's condition. Information that was academically interesting, but practically irrelevant since their focus was entirely on obtaining the best possible treatment for Sofia, rather than understanding the biological mechanisms that had created her medical needs. The prognosis had been cautiously optimistic, provided that surgical repair could be performed before Sofia's growth created additional complications. But the timing and complexity of the required procedure had made it clear that their family was facing a medical crisis that would test every resource they possessed. Maria's response to Sofia's diagnosis had been characteristic of her professional training and personal character. Immediately researching the condition and treatment options, while beginning the process of coordinating with specialists and insurance companies to ensure that Sofia received appropriate care without delays that could compromise her long-term health outcomes. Her nursing background had provided valuable insight into the medical system's complexity and bureaucracy, knowledge that proved essential for navigating the maze of referrals, authorizations, and appeals that characterized pediatric specialty care in an environment where insurance companies often prioritize cost containment over patient welfare. The binder that Maria had assembled to track Sofia's medical information had grown to include test results, specialist consultations, insurance correspondence, and research articles about treatment options, creating a comprehensive record that would prove invaluable during the difficult decisions that lay ahead. The financial impact of Sofia's medical needs had been immediate and severe, with specialist consultations, diagnostic tests, and medications creating monthly expenses that strained their budget even before the major surgical intervention had been scheduled and priced. Marcus had requested additional overtime hours at Morrison Construction while Maria had increased her nursing shifts to part-time status, both of them working longer hours while managing Sofia's care requirements and the additional stress that came with having a child whose health was constantly monitored and evaluated. The medical bills had arrived with crushing regularity, each envelope containing charges that were carefully itemized, but often incomprehensible. The relationship between services provided and amounts billed obscured by coding systems and billing practices that seem designed to confuse rather than inform patients about the cost of their care. The insurance company's response to Sofia's treatment needs had been characterized by delays, denials, and requests for additional documentation that created bureaucratic obstacles while the clock continued to run on Sofia's optimal treatment window. Each month of delay representing increased risk as her heart defect progressed and her physical development created additional surgical challenges. The appeals process had consumed countless hours of Marcus and Maria's time while generating stacks of paperwork that documented their persistence without providing any additional coverage for Sofia's needs. The insurance company's customer service representatives speaking in scripted responses that acknowledged their frustration while offering no solutions, beyond suggesting payment plans that would extend their financial obligations well into Sofia's adulthood. The pre-authorization requirements had been particularly frustrating, with the insurance company requiring multiple levels of approval for procedures that Sofia's doctors considered medically necessary and time-sensitive. Bureaucratic delays that seemed to prioritize cost containment over patient welfare. The night that had changed everything for their family had begun with what seemed like a routine evening at home. Sofia playing with her toys in the living room while Marcus and Maria cleaned up after dinner and discussed their plans for the weekend that would include another round of medical appointments and insurance phone calls. Sofia's sudden difficulty breathing had developed without warning, her normally pink complexion taking on a grayish tinge that had immediately activated Maria's professional training and sent them racing to the emergency room at Children's Hospital, where the cardiology team was waiting with the kind of urgent efficiency that confirmed their worst fears about Sofia's condition. The emergency room evaluation had revealed that Sofia's heart defect was progressing more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, creating a medical crisis that required immediate intervention to prevent life-threatening complications that could occur without warning. The conversation with Dr. Amanda Foster, Sofia's cardiologist, had taken place in a small consultation room adjoining the pediatric intensive care unit, where Sofia was being monitored and stabilized, her explanation of the surgical risks and benefits delivered with the kind of clinical precision that medical professionals used to convey life-altering information, while maintaining emotional distance from the devastating impact their words would have on already overwhelmed parents. The surgery that Sofia needed was technically complex and carried significant risks, but the alternative of continued medical management was no longer viable given the progression of her condition and the likelihood that delaying surgical intervention would result in complications that could compromise her long-term survival and quality of life. The cost estimate that Dr. Foster had provided was staggering even by the standards of modern medical care, reflecting both the technical complexity of Sofia's case and the specialized expertise required to perform the procedure with acceptable outcomes. The 3 days that Sofia had spent in the pediatric intensive care unit had been the longest 72 hours of Marcus's life, each beep and alarm from the monitoring equipment creating anxiety that was barely manageable even with Maria's professional understanding of what the various sounds and displays actually meant in terms of Sofia's moment-to-moment condition. The other families in the PICU waiting room had been dealing with their own medical crises, creating a community of shared anxiety and mutual support that helped sustain everyone through the sleepless nights and endless hours of waiting for updates from medical teams who were fighting to save children whose lives hung in the balance. The social worker who had visited them during Sofia's hospitalization had been kind and professional, but her explanation of available financial assistance programs had made it clear that their family's resources were insufficient to cover Sofia's treatment costs while their income was too high to qualify for charity care programs designed to help families with no other options. Maria's death had occurred on a Tuesday morning in spring when Sofia was 5 years old and finally stable enough for the surgical repair that had been postponed multiple times due to insurance complications and the need for additional testing. To ensure optimal timing for the complex procedure that would determine the trajectory of the rest of Sofia's life, the morning of March 15th had started like any other Tuesday in the Rivera household, with Sofia eating her cereal while watching cartoons and Maria preparing for her shift at the hospital. Her nursing scrubs neatly pressed and her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail that had become her signature look during the years of juggling motherhood and career demands. Marcus had been getting ready for work at the Morrison construction site downtown, where they were finishing the interior work on a new office building that had been behind schedule due to weather delays and material delivery problems that required constant adaptation and problem-solving from the entire crew. The family's morning routine had been comfortable and familiar, with each of them moving through their established patterns while discussing plans for Sofia's upcoming cardiology appointment and the weekend trip to visit Marcus's parents in Texas that they had been planning for months. The phone call had come at 10:47 a.m. while Marcus was reviewing blueprints with Tommy Castellanos in the construction trailer, the ringtone cutting through their discussion about electrical rough-in schedules and immediately commanding Marcus's attention because Maria never called during work hours unless something was seriously wrong. The voice on the other end had belonged to Dr. Jennifer Williams, the emergency room physician at Orange County Medical Center, her professional composure barely concealing the gravity of what she needed to communicate to a husband and father whose world was about to collapse in ways that no amount of military training or life experience could have prepared him to handle. The words serious automobile accident and significant trauma had penetrated Marcus's consciousness like physical blows, each syllable carrying implications that his mind initially refused to process, while his body responded with the kind of adrenaline surge that he hadn't experienced since his combat deployments. The drive to the hospital had passed in a blur of traffic lights and frantic phone calls, with Tommy Castellanos behind the wheel of his pickup truck while Marcus tried unsuccessfully to reach Maria's sister Elena and coordinate childcare for Sofia, whose school day would end in less than 4 hours and who would need to be picked up by someone who could explain why her parents wouldn't be there as scheduled. The accident had occurred on the Interstate 5 interchange where Maria's route to work intersected with the morning commute traffic that created daily challenges for thousands of drivers who navigated the complex system of merging lanes and construction zones that characterized Southern California's transportation infrastructure. A drunk driver running a red light had struck Maria's Honda Accord at full speed, the impact crushing the driver's side of her vehicle and creating injuries that had required immediate transport to the trauma center where a team of specialists was already working to stabilize her condition, the trauma bay where Marcus had been allowed to see Maria for what would be the last time had been filled with medical equipment and personnel working with the kind of focused intensity that he recognized from his military experience with battlefield medicine, their movements coordinated and purposeful while they fought to save a life that was slipping away despite their expertise and dedication. Maria had been unconscious and connected to multiple machines that monitored her vital signs while providing the artificial support that her body could no longer maintain independently, her face peaceful despite the severity of her injuries and the chaos of activity surrounding her hospital bed. The neurosurgeon who had explained Maria's condition had spoken with clinical precision about traumatic brain injury and spinal cord damage, medical terminology that couldn't adequately convey the devastating reality that the woman Marcus loved more than his own life would never again speak his name or hold their daughter or share the dreams they had built together during their brief but intense marriage. The decision to remove life support had been the most difficult choice Marcus had ever faced. Made after consultation with Maria's family and careful consideration of the medical team's assessment that her injuries were incompatible with meaningful recovery or quality of life. Elena Santos, Maria's younger sister, had flown in from Phoenix to help with the decision-making process and to provide Emotional support during the 48 hours that had stretched between the accident and the moment when the machines were turned off and Maria was allowed to die with dignity, surrounded by people who loved her. The hospital chaplain had been present during Maria's final moments, offering prayers in both English and Spanish, while Marcus held his wife's hand and tried to memorize every detail of her face before the inevitable separation that would define the rest of his life as a single father responsible for raising their daughter without the partner who had made everything seem possible. Sofia's reaction to her mother's death had been heartbreaking in its mixture of confusion and acceptance. Her 5-year-old mind struggling to understand concepts like permanent separation and finality while clinging to the hope that her mother might return if she wished hard enough or behaved well enough to deserve such a miracle. The funeral had been held at St. Gabriel's Catholic Church in East Los Angeles, where Maria's extended family had gathered to celebrate her life and mourn her passing while providing the kind of community support that would prove essential for Marcus and Sofia during the difficult months of adjustment that followed. The church had been filled with Maria's nursing colleagues, former patients' families, and friends from nursing school who shared memories of her compassion, professionalism, and dedication to helping others during their most vulnerable moments. Testimonials that helped Marcus understand how many lives his wife had touched during her brief but meaningful career. The transition to single parenthood had been complicated by Marcus's need to maintain his employment while providing Sofia with the emotional support and stability she needed to process her grief and adapt to life without her mother's constant presence and nurturing care. Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment next door had been invaluable during the immediate aftermath of Maria's death, caring for Sofia during work hours and helping with household tasks that Marcus was still learning to manage while dealing with his own grief and the practical challenges of reorganizing their family's daily routines. The construction crew at Morrison had been understanding about Marcus's need for flexibility with his schedule, allowing him to attend Sofia's counseling appointments and school functions while maintaining the steady employment that provided their only source of income and health insurance coverage. That the financial impact of Maria's death had been devastating despite the life insurance policy that provided a modest settlement intended to help with immediate expenses and Sofia's future educational needs. The money disappearing rapidly into medical bills, funeral costs, and the increased childcare expenses that came with single parenthood while Marcus struggled to maintain his work schedule. The drunk driver who had killed Maria had been uninsured and unemployed, making civil litigation pointless and leaving Marcus with no recourse for recovering the income that Maria's nursing career would have provided for their family's financial security. The apartment that had seemed comfortable and adequate for a family of 3 felt empty and oversized for a father and daughter who were still learning how to function as a family unit of 2, every room containing memories of Maria's presence. That made the grieving process more complex and prolonged. Sofia's heart condition had continued to progress during the emotionally tumultuous months following her mother's death, creating additional stress for Marcus, who was already struggling to balance his work responsibilities with the demands of single parenthood and his own unresolved grief over losing the woman who had been his anchor and closest confidant. Dr. Foster had been understanding about the family's changed circumstances while maintaining her professional focus on Sofia's medical needs, recommending counseling services that could help Sofia process her mother's death while managing the anxiety that often accompanied chronic medical conditions in young children. The cardiology appointments had become more frequent as Sofia's condition worsened, each visit confirming that surgical intervention was becoming increasingly urgent while the family's financial resources were being depleted by the ongoing costs of medical care and the loss of Maria's income. The insurance company's response to Maria's death had been characteristically bureaucratic, requiring death certificates and beneficiary documentation while reviewing Sofia's continued coverage under Marcus's military insurance policy and investigating whether her pre-existing condition might affect her eligibility for certain treatments. The customer service representatives had been professionally sympathetic while explaining policy provisions that seemed designed to limit coverage rather than provide support during a family's most difficult time, their scripted responses offering condolences while requesting additional paperwork that would delay processing of claims that Sofia's doctors considered urgent and medically necessary. The appeals process for denied claims had become a part-time job that consumed Marcus's evenings and weekends, generating correspondence that documented his persistence while providing no additional coverage for Sofia's mounting medical expenses. Support group for widowed parents that Marcus had reluctantly joined at the recommendation of Sofia's counselor had provided an unexpected source of practical advice and emotional understanding from other single parents who were navigating similar challenges with varying degrees of success and different approaches to managing their children's needs while dealing with their own grief. The weekly meetings at the community center had been initially uncomfortable for Marcus, whose military background had taught him to handle problems independently rather than seeking help from others. But the shared experiences and mutual support had gradually become an important source of stability during his darkest moments. The other parents in the group had been dealing with their own variations of loss and adjustment, creating a community of understanding that couldn't replace what had been lost, but could provide encouragement and practical suggestions for managing the daily challenges of single parenthood. The progression of Sofia's heart condition had accelerated during her 7th year, requiring more frequent monitoring and medication adjustments, while her activity level became increasingly restricted. To prevent dangerous complications that could occur during physical exertion or emotional stress, the playground activities that other children took for granted had become off-limits for Sofia, whose exercise tolerance was carefully monitored by Marcus and her teachers while she watched her classmates participate in sports and games that her heart couldn't safely handle. The social isolation that resulted from her activity restrictions had been particularly difficult for Sofia, whose outgoing personality and desire to participate in normal childhood activities were constantly thwarted by medical limitations that she was too young to fully understand but old enough to resent. The decision to pursue surgical repair of Sofia's heart defect had been driven by Dr. Foster's assessment that continued medical management was no longer adequate to prevent life-threatening complications as Sofia continued to grow and her heart struggled to meet the increasing demands of her developing body. The surgery itself was technically complex and carried significant risks, but the alternative of continued deterioration made the procedure medically necessary rather than elective, a distinction that should have influenced insurance coverage, but seemed to have little impact on the bureaucratic obstacles that Marcus encountered while trying to obtain pre-authorization for Sofia's treatment. The cost estimate that had been provided by Children's Memorial Hospital had been staggering even by the standards of modern pediatric cardiac surgery, reflecting both the complexity of Sofia's case and the specialized expertise required to perform the procedure with acceptable outcomes and minimal risk of complications. The months leading up to the current crisis had been marked by increasing urgency from Sofia's medical team and growing frustration with the insurance company's delays and denials, creating a situation where time was running out, while bureaucratic obstacles prevented access to the treatment that could save Sofia's life or significantly improve her long-term prognosis. Marcus had exhausted every avenue for financial assistance, applying for charity care programs that had waiting lists extending beyond Sofia's safe treatment window and investigating medical loans that required credit scores and collateral that his family's circumstances made impossible to obtain. The consultation with the hospital's financial counselor had been his last hope for finding a viable path forward, and the crushing reality of their final assessment had left him feeling more defeated than he had felt since the day Maria died. The impossible mathematics of their situation confirming that his daughter's life was in jeopardy because of circumstances beyond his control or ability to influence. The woman who approached Marcus in the hospital parking lot moved with the kind of purposeful confidence that immediately set her apart from the usual collection of anxious family members and exhausted medical staff who populated the area during late-night hours. Her stride steady and assured despite the challenging terrain of cracked asphalt and scattered puddles that reflected the harsh glare of sodium vapor lights. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that had somehow maintained its composure despite what must have been a long day. And she wore a charcoal gray wool coat that spoke of quality tailoring and attention to detail that extended to her leather gloves and the understated jewelry that caught the light as she moved closer to where Marcus was struggling with his recalcitrant tire. Her face was striking rather than conventionally beautiful, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his situation, while maintaining the kind of professional composure that suggested someone accustomed to making important decisions under pressure. Her expression conveying concern without pity and competence without condescension. There was something in her bearing that reminded Marcus of the senior officers he had served under during his military career, an air of quiet authority that came from years of accepting responsibility for outcomes that affected other people's lives, though her civilian attire and the late hour made her presence in the hospital parking lot puzzling rather than easily categorizable. She carried herself with the kind of poise that suggested expensive education and professional success, but there was also a warmth in her expression that indicated genuine concern for his predicament, rather than mere polite interest in a stranger's automotive difficulties. "Excuse me," she said as she approached within conversational distance, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who was accustomed to being listened to and understood, though there was nothing imperious or demanding in her tone that might have suggested someone who expected deference based on her obvious social status. "I couldn't help but notice you're having some trouble with your tire. I know this might seem unusual, but I actually have some experience with this sort of thing, and I'd be happy to help if you'd like another pair of hands." Her offer was made with the kind of straightforward directness that Marcus appreciated, without the elaborate social preliminaries that often accompanied interactions between strangers, and there was something in her manner that suggested she was genuinely willing to get her expensive-looking clothes dirty in service of helping someone she'd never met. Marcus looked up from his position beside the Honda, taking in the incongruity of a woman who clearly belonged in boardrooms or upscale restaurants, offering to assist with manual labor in a hospital parking lot at 2 o'clock in the morning, his initial impulse being to decline her offer politely, while wondering what circumstances had brought someone of her apparent means to this particular place at this particular time. "That's very kind of you to offer," he replied, straightening up carefully to avoid aggravating his injured leg while trying to assess whether her assistance would be genuinely helpful or merely well-intentioned interference from someone who had no practical experience with automotive repair. "I have to admit I'm surprised to find someone dressed for business willing to help change a tire at this hour, especially here in a hospital parking lot where most people have other things on their minds." The woman smiled at his observation, a genuine expression that transformed her serious features and revealed the kind of warmth that made her professional composure seem less intimidating and more approachable, though there remained something mysterious about her presence that Marcus couldn't quite place despite his usually reliable ability to read people and situations accurately. "You'd be surprised how often life requires us to do things that don't match our appearance or our original plans for the evening," she said, already moving closer to examine his situation with the kind of systematic assessment that suggested someone who was accustomed to solving problems efficiently and thoroughly. "Besides, I suspect we're both here for reasons that have very little to do with what we expected when we woke up this morning, and sometimes helping someone else is exactly what we need to put our own problems in perspective." Her comment about unexpected circumstances resonated with Marcus in ways that made him curious about what had brought her to Children's Memorial Hospital during the early morning hours, though he recognized that hospital parking lots were places where personal tragedies and family crises intersected with the kind of privacy that made intrusive questions inappropriate, regardless of natural curiosity. "You're probably right about that," he agreed, accepting her offer of assistance with the kind of gracious resignation that came from recognizing when pride was less important than practical necessity. "If you're serious about helping, I could definitely use someone to hold the flashlight while I work on these lug nuts that seem to have been installed by someone with a pneumatic wrench and a grudge against future tire changes." The woman laughed at his description, a sound that was both genuine and musical in ways that seemed to lighten the oppressive atmosphere of their parking lot encounter while revealing a personality that went beyond the professional competence she had initially displayed, her response suggesting someone who appreciated humor even in difficult circumstances and who possessed the kind of emotional intelligence that made her easy to talk to despite their status as complete strangers. "I think I can manage flashlight duty without compromising either of our safety or my professional reputation," she said, producing a small but powerful LED flashlight from her purse with the kind of preparedness that suggested someone who had learned to anticipate potential problems and plan accordingly. "Though I have to admit that automotive repair wasn't covered in any of the professional development courses I've taken over the years." As she positioned herself to provide optimal lighting for his work on the lug nuts, Marcus found himself grateful not only for the practical assistance, but also for the distraction that her presence provided from the devastating financial reality that had dominated his thoughts since leaving the hospital's financial counselor's office hours earlier. The conversation with Patricia Chun had left him feeling helpless and overwhelmed in ways that reminded him of the worst moments of his military medical discharge, when bureaucratic systems had seemed designed to frustrate rather than assist. Someone who was trying to navigate unfamiliar territory without adequate guidance or support. The woman's willingness to help with his immediate problem created a small oasis of human kindness that made the larger crisis seem slightly more manageable, even though he knew that getting his car operational wouldn't solve any of the fundamental problems that kept him awake most nights, calculating and recalculating figures that never added up to hope. "I'm Elena Vasquez, by the way," she said as Marcus began making progress on the stubborn lug nuts, her introduction offered with the kind of casual formality that suggested someone who was comfortable in social situations while maintaining appropriate boundaries with strangers, though her name carried a slight accent that hinted at cultural background that might explain some of the warmth and directness that Marcus had found immediately appealing. "I realize this isn't exactly conventional circumstances for introductions, but given that we're collaborating on automotive repair at an hour when most sensible people are asleep, I thought we should at least know each other's names." Her comment was delivered with a slight smile that acknowledged the unusual nature of their meeting, while establishing a level of personal connection that felt natural rather than forced or artificial. "Marcus Rivera," he replied, pausing in his work to acknowledge her introduction properly, while noting that her handshake was firm and confident in ways that reinforced his impression of someone who is accustomed to professional interactions, where personal credibility mattered more than social positioning. "And you're absolutely right about the unconventional circumstances, though I have to say that your timing is remarkably good, since I was beginning to think I might be spending the rest of the night in this parking lot, trying to convince these lug nuts to cooperate with my limited leverage and deteriorating patience." The physical work was providing a welcome outlet for the frustration and anxiety that had been building throughout the evening, though he was careful to pace himself to avoid aggravating his leg injury in ways that would create additional problems. On top of his current automotive and financial difficulties, Elena's assistance proved to be genuinely helpful rather than merely symbolic. Her steady hands and intuitive understanding of how to position the flashlight for maximum effectiveness suggesting someone who had practical experience with problem-solving in challenging circumstances, though her expensive clothing and professional Demeanor continued to puzzle Marcus about what had brought her to this particular hospital at this particular time. "You mentioned that life requires us to do unexpected things," he said as he worked on the final lug nut, curiosity overcoming his usual reluctance to ask personal questions of strangers, whose privacy deserved the same respect he hoped to receive. Regarding his own family's medical crisis, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what brings someone to a children's hospital in the middle of the night, wearing what looks like business attire from an important meeting or social event?" Elena was quiet for a moment, her expression becoming more serious as she considered how much personal information to share with someone she had just met, though her willingness to help with his tire problem suggested a level of openness that made complete privacy seem unnecessarily formal given their current circumstances. "Professional obligations," she said finally, her answer both truthful and deliberately vague in ways that respected both his curiosity and her own need for privacy regarding whatever circumstances had brought her to Children's Memorial Hospital. During the early morning hours, sometimes work in the medical field requires unusual hours and emergency consultations that can't wait for regular business schedules, though I'll admit that tonight has been particularly challenging even by the standards of what I usually consider normal professional demands." Her reference to medical field work explained some of the professional competence and emotional composure that Marcus had observed, though it raised additional questions about what kind of medical practice required business attire and emergency hospital visits during the middle of the night, possibilities that ranged from administrative work to specialized consulting that might explain her presence without revealing the specific details of her professional responsibilities. "That makes sense," Marcus replied, respecting her desire for privacy while appreciating her honesty about the challenging nature of whatever had brought her to the hospital, his military experience having taught him to recognize when someone was dealing with stress or difficult circumstances, even when they maintained professional composure. "Medical emergencies definitely don't follow convenient schedules, and I imagine that whatever you're dealing with tonight has been just as unexpected and demanding as my automotive difficulties, though probably considerably more important in the larger scheme of things." The tire change was progressing more smoothly with Elena's assistance, her steady hands and reliable lighting allowing Marcus to work efficiently despite his fatigue and the emotional weight of the evening's consultation with the hospital's financial team, the physical activity providing a temporary respite from the impossible calculations that had dominated his thoughts since learning the final cost estimate for Sofia's surgery. The simple act of completing a practical task with competent assistance from a helpful stranger was restoring some small measure of confidence in his ability to handle problems and find solutions, even though he knew that automotive repair was significantly less complex than navigating the healthcare financing maze that threatened his daughter's access to life-saving treatment. Elena's presence and willingness to help had transformed what could have been a frustrating and solitary struggle into a collaborative effort that reminded him that human kindness still existed even in circumstances where everything seemed stacked against ordinary people trying to protect their families. "There we go," Marcus said as the final lug nut came free, allowing him to remove the flat tire and begin the process of installing the spare that would get him home to Sofia, who was probably sleeping peacefully under Mrs. Rodriguez's watchful care while remaining blissfully unaware of the financial crisis that threatened her access to the medical treatment she desperately needed. "I really appreciate your help with this, Elena. Having someone hold the light steady made this job considerably easier than it would have been if I'd been trying to manage everything myself, and I have to admit that having some company during what's been a pretty difficult evening has been more helpful than you probably realize." His gratitude was genuine and went beyond the practical assistance she had provided, encompassing the human connection and reminder that people could still be kind to strangers without expecting anything in return. As Marcus worked to install the spare tire, Elena maintained her position with the flashlight, while engaging in the kind of casual conversation that helped pass the time and distract from whatever personal concerns had brought both of them to the hospital parking lot during the early morning hours. Her questions about his work and family life offered with genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Her ability to listen actively while providing practical assistance suggested someone who possessed both emotional intelligence and professional competence, qualities that made Marcus curious about her background and training, even as he respected her privacy regarding the specific circumstances of her hospital visit. The conversation flowed naturally despite their status as strangers, covering topics that ranged from the challenges of living in Southern California to observations about the healthcare system that revealed shared concerns about accessibility and affordability without requiring either of them to reveal personal details that might be too private for casual discussion. The spare tire installation was completed more quickly than Marcus had expected, Elena's assistance having eliminated many of the delays and frustrations that typically accompanied roadside automotive repair, especially when performed by someone whose injured leg limited his mobility and whose emotional state was already compromised by the stress of impossible financial decisions. "That should get you where you're going," he said, standing up carefully and testing his weight on his injured leg, while surveying their completed work with satisfaction that was tempered by awareness that solving his transportation problem hadn't addressed any of the fundamental challenges that would be waiting for him when he returned home to face another sleepless night of calculating figures that never added up to hope. As Marcus secured the flat tire in his trunk and prepared to express his gratitude one final time before departing for home, Elena Vasquez stood quietly beside her own vehicle, a sleek black Mercedes sedan that seemed to materialize from the shadows of the parking lot like a piece of expensive automotive sculpture that belonged in a luxury showroom rather than the utilitarian landscape of a hospital parking area. The contrast between her elegant car and his aging Honda Civic was stark enough to reinforce Marcus's impression that they came from completely different worlds, though her willingness to help with his tire change had demonstrated that social and economic differences didn't necessarily prevent genuine human connection when circumstances brought strangers together in moments of mutual need. The Mercedes bore no visible signs of the kind of wear and mechanical compromise that characterized Marcus's vehicle, its pristine condition and sophisticated design suggesting someone whose financial resources allowed for reliable transportation that rarely required emergency repairs in hospital parking lots during the early morning hours. "Thank you again for your help," Marcus said, wiping his hands on the shop rag he kept in his trunk, while trying to process the surreal nature of an evening that had begun with devastating financial news and progressed through automotive failure to an unexpected encounter with a mysterious woman whose presence had somehow made his immediate problems seem more manageable despite their fundamental complexity. "I know this wasn't how you planned to spend your time tonight, and I really appreciate your willingness to get involved when you could have just walked by and left me to figure things out on my own." His gratitude was genuine and encompassed not only her practical assistance, but also the reminder that human kindness still existed in a world that often seemed designed to pit people against each other in competitions for limited resources and opportunities. Elena smiled at his thanks, her expression thoughtful as she seemed to be processing their conversation and weighing decisions about how much additional information to share with someone she had just met under circumstances that had created an unusual level of intimacy despite their status as complete strangers. "You're very welcome, Marcus," she replied, her voice carrying a warmth that suggested their interaction had been meaningful for her as well, though there remained something in her manner that indicated she was still considering whether to reveal additional information about herself or her reasons for being at the hospital during such an unusual hour. "I have to say that helping you with your tire has been one of the more positive parts of what's been a very challenging evening for me as well. And sometimes doing something practical and straightforward is exactly what we need when everything else in our lives seems complicated, beyond our ability to manage. Her comment about finding their tire changing collaboration to be a positive experience during an otherwise difficult evening suggested that Elena was dealing with her own version of crisis or stress, though the nature of her professional attire. An expensive car indicated that her challenges were probably different in character from the financial desperation that had brought Marcus to his current breaking point. The hospital environment attracted people facing various forms of medical crisis, from routine procedures and consultations to life-threatening emergencies that tested families' emotional and financial resources in ways that revealed both human resilience and systemic inadequacies in healthcare accessibility and affordability. Marcus found himself curious about what specific circumstances had brought someone of Elena's apparent means and professional status to Children's Memorial Hospital during the middle of the night, though he recognized that hospital parking lots were places where personal tragedies intersected with privacy considerations that made intrusive questions inappropriate, regardless of natural human curiosity. "I hope whatever brought you here tonight works out the way you're hoping," Marcus said, offering the kind of general support that acknowledged her apparent stress without requiring her to reveal details that she might prefer to keep private. His military experience having taught him to recognize when people were dealing with difficult situations, even when they maintained professional composure and emotional control. Sometimes these late-night hospital visits are for routine things that seem more dramatic than they actually are, but sometimes they're for situations that really are as serious as they feel, and either way, it helps to know that there are still people willing to help strangers when they encounter problems they can't solve alone. His comment was intended to provide emotional support without being presumptuous about her circumstances, acknowledging the stress she seemed to be experiencing, while respecting her obvious desire for privacy regarding whatever had brought her to the hospital. Elena looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face with the kind of careful assessment that suggested someone who was accustomed to making important decisions about people based on limited information, but who wanted to be certain about character and motivations before proceeding with revelations that might have significant consequences. "Marcus," she said finally, her voice taking on a different quality that indicated a shift from casual conversation to something more serious and purposeful. "I hope you won't think I'm being intrusive, but I couldn't help overhearing part of your phone conversation earlier, and I get the impression that you're dealing with some significant challenges beyond just automotive problems." Her observation was delivered with sensitivity and tact, acknowledging that she had inadvertently overheard private information, while making it clear that her interest was motivated by concern rather than mere curiosity. About a stranger's personal business, Marcus felt a flush of embarrassment at the realization that his phone conversations with Mrs. Rodriguez about Sofia's condition and their financial situation had been audible to someone whose opinion of him might be influenced by knowledge of his family's desperate circumstances, though Elena's expression suggested sympathy rather than judgment about whatever information she had accidentally acquired during their parking lot encounter. "I suppose hospital parking lots aren't exactly private places for personal phone calls," he acknowledged, trying to maintain his dignity while recognizing that their conversation had probably revealed more about his situation than he would have chosen to share with a stranger under normal circumstances. "You're right that I'm dealing with some challenges that go beyond automotive repair, though I appreciate your discretion about whatever you might have overheard during what wasn't my most composed evening." "I don't want to pry into your personal business," Elena continued, her manner remaining respectful and professional while conveying genuine concern that went beyond polite social interaction. "But if you're comfortable sharing, I might be able to offer some perspective or assistance that could be helpful for whatever situation you're facing." Her offer was made tentatively, with clear understanding that Marcus had every right to decline discussion of private matters with someone he had just met, though there was something in her manner that suggested she possessed relevant experience. or resources that might actually prove valuable rather than representing empty sympathy from someone who couldn't understand his circumstances. The specificity of her offer to provide assistance, rather than merely emotional support, indicated that she had reasons for believing she might be able to help with practical problems rather than just offering the kind of well-intentioned but ultimately useless advice that characterized most casual conversations about serious difficulties. The decision about how much to reveal to Elena required Marcus to weigh his natural privacy instincts against the possibility that someone with her apparent professional competence and medical field connections might possess insights or resources that could prove helpful for navigating the healthcare financing maze that threatened Sofia's access to life-saving treatment. His military experience had taught him to evaluate potential allies based on their demonstrated competence and character rather than their background or social status, and Elena's willingness to help with his tire change had provided evidence of both practical capability and genuine concern for others that suggested she might be trustworthy with sensitive information about his family's medical crisis. The worst-case scenario of revealing his situation to someone who couldn't help seemed minimal compared to the potential benefits of connecting with someone who might have relevant expertise or resources, especially given that his other options for financial assistance had been systematically eliminated through months of unsuccessful applications and appeals. My 8-year-old daughter Sofia has a congenital heart defect that requires surgical repair, Marcus said, making the decision to trust Elena with the basic facts of their situation while monitoring her reaction for signs of either genuine understanding or the kind of superficial sympathy that characterized most people's responses to medical crises they couldn't relate to personally. The surgery is technically complex and expensive, and despite having military insurance that covers part of the cost, we're still facing about $60,000 in out-of-pocket expenses that I simply don't have. The numbers sounded even more overwhelming when spoken aloud to someone whose expensive car and professional attire suggested she lived in a world where $60,000 might represent an inconvenience rather than an impossible obstacle to a child's survival. Elena's expression became more serious as she absorbed the information about Sofia's condition and their financial situation. Her professional composure shifting to reveal genuine concern that seemed to go beyond polite sympathy to encompass the kind of engaged attention that suggested she understood both the medical and financial implications of what Marcus had described. Congenital heart defects in children are serious conditions that require specialized care, she said, her response demonstrating knowledge that went beyond casual familiarity with medical terminology to suggest professional experience with pediatric cardiac issues. The costs associated with pediatric cardiac surgery can be overwhelming even for families with good insurance coverage, and the timing considerations often make it impossible to delay treatment while pursuing financial assistance, options that might take months to process. Her knowledgeable response about pediatric cardiac surgery and its associated costs confirmed Marcus's impression that Elena possessed medical field expertise that might prove relevant to their situation, though he remained uncertain about whether her willingness to discuss his family's problems indicated professional interest or personal concern for their circumstances. The doctors are saying that Sofia's condition is progressing and that delaying surgery much longer could result in complications that would make the procedure more dangerous or less effective, he explained, sharing the information that had been keeping him awake for weeks while he tried unsuccessfully to identify viable solutions to their financial crisis. I've applied for every form of assistance I can find, from charity care programs to medical loans, but everything either has waiting lists that extend beyond Sofia's safe treatment window or requires financial qualifications that we don't meet. What hospital is treating Sofia? Elena asked, her question posed with the kind of professional interest that suggested she might have relevant connections or insights about specific institutions and their policies. regarding charity care and financial assistance programs for families facing similar circumstances. Different hospitals have different approaches to financial assistance, and sometimes there are resources available that aren't immediately obvious through standard financial counseling channels. Her comment about hidden resources and alternative assistance channels indicated that she possessed insider knowledge about healthcare financing that went beyond what most patients and families encountered during their initial consultations with financial counselors, raising the possibility that her offer to help might extend beyond emotional support to include practical guidance about navigating systems that were designed to be complex and discouraging. Children's Memorial Hospital, Marcus replied, noting that Elena's expression showed immediate recognition of the institution's name and reputation, her reaction suggesting familiarity that went beyond general awareness of local medical facilities to encompass specific knowledge about their policies, procedures, and personnel. We had our consultation with their financial counselor this evening, which is why I was here so late and why I was on the phone trying to coordinate childcare for tomorrow while processing what feels like impossibly bad news about our options for funding Sofia's surgery. The admission that his evening had been spent receiving devastating financial news helped explain his emotional state and the phone conversations that Elena had accidentally overheard, providing context for their parking lot encounter that made his current circumstances more understandable. Children's Memorial has an excellent pediatric cardiac surgery program, Elena observed, her comment delivered with the kind of specific knowledge that suggested professional familiarity with the institution's capabilities and reputation rather than general public awareness of its services. Dr. Jonathan Hayes leads their cardiac surgery team, and his outcomes for complex congenital repairs are among the best in the country. Her mention of specific personnel and performance metrics confirmed that she possessed insider knowledge about Children's Memorial Hospital that went far beyond what most people would know about medical institutions they weren't professionally connected to, raising additional questions about her background and the nature of her late-night visit to the facility. The conversation was taking on a character that suggested Elena's offer of assistance might be more substantive than Marcus had initially assumed. Her demonstrated knowledge about pediatric cardiac surgery and specific institutional capabilities, indicating that she was qualified to provide the kind of informed guidance that could prove genuinely helpful for navigating their complex situation. You seem to know quite a bit about Children's Memorial and their cardiac program, Marcus observed, his curiosity about Elena's background overcoming his reluctance to ask direct questions about someone's professional credentials and institutional connections. I'm beginning to suspect that your late-night hospital visit might be related to work that gives you insights about medical institutions and their policies that most people wouldn't have access to. Elena smiled at his perceptive observation, her expression suggesting that she had been expecting him to recognize the implications of her detailed knowledge about Children's Memorial Hospital and its pediatric cardiac surgery program, though. She still seemed to be weighing how much additional information to reveal about her professional background and potential ability to assist with Sofia's treatment needs. You're very observant, Marcus, she said, her tone acknowledging his accurate assessment while indicating that she was prepared to be more forthcoming about her credentials and connections. I do have professional experience that gives me more familiarity with pediatric cardiac surgery than most people possess, and I think there might be options for Sofia's care that weren't discussed during your consultation with the hospital's standard financial counseling services. Elena reached into her purse with deliberate precision, withdrawing a business card that caught the parking lot's harsh fluorescent lighting and revealed elegant embossing that spoke of professional significance and institutional authority. Her movements careful and purposeful as she extended the card toward Marcus with an expression that had shifted from casual helpfulness to something approaching professional disclosure. The card itself was heavy stock with a subtle texture that suggested quality and importance, Its design understated but clearly expensive in the way that institutional credentials often were, bearing information that would reshape Marcus's understanding of who he had been talking to during their roadside encounter, and what her offer of assistance might actually entail for Sofia's medical treatment. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Marcus read aloud from the card, his voice reflecting surprise and growing comprehension as he processed the additional titles and affiliations listed below her name. Each line of text revealing layers of professional achievement and institutional connection that explained her knowledge about Children's Memorial Hospital and pediatric cardiac surgery, while raising entirely new questions about what had brought someone of her apparent stature to help him change a tire at 2 o'clock in the morning. Chief of Pediatric Cardiac Surgery, Director of Congenital Heart Program, Children's Memorial Hospital. The final line of her credentials hit him with the force of revelation, transforming their entire conversation from a chance encounter between strangers into something approaching a consultation with one of the most qualified medical professionals in the country for addressing Sofia's specific condition. The realization that he had been discussing his daughter's case with the very surgeon who would potentially perform her operation created a mixture of embarrassment and hope that left Marcus momentarily speechless, his mind racing to process the implications of Elena's identity, while trying to understand what confluence of circumstances had brought Sofia's potential surgeon to his assistance during the worst night of his family's financial crisis. "I feel like I should apologize for not recognizing you," he said finally, though Elena's casual demeanor during their tire-changing collaboration suggested that she had deliberately avoided revealing her professional identity until she felt comfortable with his character and circumstances. "And I should probably also apologize for discussing Sofia's case so informally when you're the surgeon who might actually be treating her, though I have to admit that learning who you are makes this evening feel considerably less coincidental than it did a few minutes ago." Elena laughed softly at his response, her expression conveying understanding and reassurance rather than any sense that formal recognition or deference was required despite the revelation of her professional status and expertise in the specific medical field that dominated Marcus's current concerns about Sofia's health and treatment options. "Please don't feel embarrassed about not recognizing me," she said, her tone maintaining the same warmth and directness that had characterized their conversation before his discovery of her credentials. "I deliberately didn't introduce myself with my professional title because I wanted our conversation to develop naturally rather than being influenced by preconceptions about what doctors can or should do when they encounter families dealing with complex medical situations outside of formal clinical settings." Her explanation about deliberately concealing her professional identity suggested that Elena's approach to their encounter had been more calculated than Marcus had initially realized, though her motivations appeared to be rooted in genuine concern for his family situation rather than professional curiosity or casual interest in meeting patients outside of hospital walls. "I have to ask," Marcus said, his curiosity about the circumstances of their meeting overcoming his tendency toward privacy and discretion when dealing with people whose professional authority exceeded his own understanding of medical institutions and their hierarchies. "What brings the chief of pediatric cardiac surgery to a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning? Was our meeting really as coincidental as it seemed, or have you been aware of Sofia's case before tonight?" Elena's expression became more serious as she considered how to explain her presence at the hospital during such an unusual hour, her professional composure indicating that she was accustomed to managing complex situations that required careful balance between personal and professional considerations. "I was called in for an emergency consultation on a case that required immediate surgical intervention," she explained, her response providing a logical explanation for her hospital visit while maintaining appropriate patient confidentiality about the specific circumstances that had brought her to Children's Memorial during the early morning hours. "The surgery concluded about an hour ago," and I was on my way to my car when I saw you struggling with your tire and decided to offer assistance rather than assuming someone else would help. Her account of the emergency surgery consultation explained both her professional attire and her presence at the hospital, though Marcus found himself wondering whether their encounter was truly as random as Elena was suggesting, or whether she had somehow been aware of his financial consultation earlier in the evening and had deliberately positioned herself to meet him during his departure from the facility. "So our meeting really was just a coincidence?" he asked, studying her expression for any indication that their tire-changing collaboration had been orchestrated rather than spontaneous, though he recognized that his family's desperate circumstances might be making him paranoid about the motivations of people who showed genuine interest in helping with Sofia's medical needs. The possibility that Sofia's potential surgeon had accidentally encountered them during their family's financial crisis seemed almost too convenient to be entirely coincidental, though Elena's willingness to help with manual labor suggested genuine spontaneity rather than calculated professional intervention. "Completely coincidental," Elena confirmed, her response delivered with the kind of straightforward honesty that had characterized their entire conversation and suggested that whatever professional interest she might have in Sofia's case had developed organically from their parking lot encounter, rather than pre-existing knowledge of their family's medical and financial circumstances. "Though I have to admit that learning about Sofia's condition and your financial situation has made me realize that our chance meeting might represent an opportunity to address some of the systemic problems that I see regularly in my practice, where families with excellent insurance coverage still face financial barriers to accessing pediatric cardiac surgery that can delay treatment in ways that compromise optimal outcomes." Her comment about systemic problems and financial barriers suggested that Elena's interest in their situation extended beyond Sofia's individual case to encompass broader concerns about healthcare accessibility and the impact of cost considerations on medical decision-making, perspectives that aligned with Marcus's own frustrations about insurance coverage that was theoretically adequate but practically insufficient for addressing complex medical needs. "The financial counselor made it pretty clear that our options are limited, despite having military insurance that should cover most medical expenses," Marcus said, sharing his interpretation of the evening's consultation while recognizing that Elena's professional position might provide insights about institutional policies and alternative funding sources that weren't available through standard financial counseling channels. $60,000 in out-of-pocket expenses might as well be $60 million for someone in my financial situation, especially when the hospital requires significant upfront payments before scheduling surgery that Sofia needs sooner rather than later. Elena nodded thoughtfully at his description of the financial barriers they were facing, her expression indicating both professional understanding of insurance limitations and personal concern for the impact that cost considerations were having on Sofia's access to timely medical treatment. "The reality is that even excellent insurance coverage often includes deductibles, co-payments, and coverage limitations that can create substantial financial obligations for families dealing with complex pediatric medical conditions," she explained, her professional experience providing context for the insurance maze that Marcus had been unsuccessfully navigating for months. "What makes this particularly frustrating is that delayed treatment for Sofia's condition could result in complications that would make surgery more complex and expensive while producing outcomes that are less optimal than what we could achieve with immediate intervention." Her clinical assessment of the risks associated with delayed treatment confirmed Marcus's worst fears about the consequences of their financial inability to proceed with Sofia's surgery according to the optimal medical timeline. The possibility that cost considerations might compromise Sofia's long-term health outcomes, adding urgency to their need for alternative funding solutions. "Is there any chance that Sofia's case might qualify for some kind of special consideration or alternative funding? Arrangement that wasn't discussed during my consultation with the financial counselor? Marcus asked, hoping that Elena's professional position might provide access to institutional resources that weren't available through standard financial assistance programs. I'm willing to explore any option that might allow Sofia to receive the treatment she needs without delaying surgery, in ways that could affect her prognosis or recovery outcomes. Elena was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful as she considered various possibilities for addressing Sofia's financial and medical needs while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and institutional policies that governed her interactions with potential patients and their families. There are several options that might not have been fully explored during your standard financial consultation, she said carefully, her response indicating that she possessed knowledge about alternative funding sources and institutional policies that could prove relevant to Sofia's case. Children's Memorial has discretionary funds for cases that present unusual circumstances, and there are also private foundations and charitable organizations that specifically support pediatric cardiac surgery for families facing financial hardship. Her mention of discretionary funds and private foundations suggested possibilities that Marcus had not encountered during his months of research into financial assistance options, raising hope that Elena's professional connections might provide access to resources that weren't readily apparent to families navigating the system without insider knowledge. Would Sofia's case potentially qualify for consideration under any of these alternative funding sources? He asked, trying to balance realistic expectations with cautious optimism about possibilities that might address their financial crisis while allowing Sofia to receive timely medical treatment. And if so, what would be required to pursue these options in terms of applications, documentation, or approval processes that might take time we don't really have? Let me ask you directly, Elena said, her tone becoming more formal as she shifted into professional mode while maintaining the personal warmth that had characterized their conversation throughout their parking lot encounter. If cost were not a consideration, would you want Sofia's surgery to be performed at Children's Memorial by our cardiac surgery team? Her question was straightforward and practical, focusing on medical decision-making rather than financial considerations while establishing whether Marcus's concerns about their financial situation were preventing him from pursuing optimal medical care for Sofia's condition. The directness of her inquiry suggested that she was prepared to discuss specific solutions rather than continuing to explore problems and obstacles that they both already understood clearly. Absolutely, Marcus replied without hesitation, his response reflecting both his research into pediatric cardiac surgery options and his recognition that Elena's professional reputation and institutional affiliation represented the highest quality of medical care available for Sofia's specific condition. Everything I've learned about Sofia's heart defect indicates that Children's Memorial has the best outcomes for complex congenital repairs, and if finances weren't an issue, there's nowhere else I would want her to receive treatment. His answer eliminated any ambiguity about his medical preferences while confirming that cost considerations were the primary obstacle preventing Sofia from accessing optimal care rather than concerns about institutional quality or professional competence. Elena nodded approvingly at his response, her expression indicating that his preference for Children's Memorial aligned with her professional assessment of what would provide Sofia with the best possible outcomes for her specific cardiac condition. In that case, she said, reaching into her purse again to retrieve what appeared to be a prescription pad. Though instead of writing medication instructions, she began writing something that would prove far more significant for Sofia's future health and their family's financial stability. I'm going to provide you with a direct phone number for my office administrator, along with specific instructions about how to schedule Sofia for immediate surgical consultation and preoperative evaluation. Her action suggested that she was prepared to circumvent standard scheduling procedures and financial clearance, requirements that had been creating delays in Sofia's access to treatment. "I need you to understand," Elena continued as she wrote, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that Marcus imagined she used when delivering important medical information to families facing critical decisions about their children's health and treatment options. "What I'm about to propose is going to address both the financial and timing concerns that have been preventing Sofia from receiving the surgery she needs." The gravity of her tone suggested that she was prepared to make commitments or arrangements that went beyond standard institutional policies, though Marcus remained uncertain about what specific solution she had in mind for addressing their $60,000 financial obstacle to Sofia's treatment. Elena finished writing and handed Marcus a folded piece of paper along with her business card, her expression conveying both professional confidence and personal satisfaction in being able to offer substantive assistance rather than merely sympathy for their difficult circumstances. "Inside that paper is a number that will connect you directly with Maria Santos in my office," she explained, her instructions specific and actionable rather than vague promises about exploring possibilities that might or might not prove viable. "When you call tomorrow morning, tell Maria that Dr. Vasquez has personally approved Sofia Rivera for immediate scheduling under our family emergency protocol, and that all financial arrangements should be processed through our discretionary surgical fund rather than standard insurance billing procedures." Marcus stared at the paper in his hand, struggling to process the implications of what Elena was telling him while trying to understand whether she was somehow offering to cover Sofia's surgical costs through institutional resources or personal arrangements that seemed too generous to be real. "I'm not sure I understand what you're proposing," he said honestly, his military experience having taught him to clarify expectations and obligations before accepting assistance that might come with hidden costs or complications. "Are you saying that Sofia's surgery can be performed without the $60,000 in out-of-pocket expenses that the financial counselor said would be required? And if so, what would that mean in terms of our obligations or your expectations for repayment or other arrangements?" Elena smiled at his cautious response, her expression conveying understanding and respect for his need to understand the terms and implications of what she was offering rather than accepting charity without comprehending the full scope of the arrangement. "What I'm proposing is that Sofia's surgery be funded entirely through Children's Memorial's charitable care program and private foundation grants that I have discretionary authority to approve for cases that meet specific medical and humanitarian criteria," she explained, her professional authority providing access to resources that weren't available through standard financial assistance channels. "There would be no cost to your family, no repayment obligations, and no strings attached beyond our mutual commitment to providing Sofia with the best possible medical care and supporting her recovery process." The magnitude of Elena's offer hit Marcus with an emotional force that left him momentarily unable to respond, his mind struggling to process the reality that the desperate financial crisis that had consumed his thoughts for months could potentially be resolved through the generosity of someone he had met while changing a tire in a hospital parking lot at 2 o'clock in the morning. The transition from hopeless desperation to unexpected salvation was so dramatic that he found himself questioning whether he had correctly understood Elena's proposal. The possibility that Sofia's surgery could be performed without any financial obligation seeming too extraordinary to be real, despite coming from someone whose professional credentials and institutional authority provided the legitimacy necessary to make such arrangements possible. "I need to make sure I understand what you're offering," Marcus said carefully, his military training in risk assessment and contingency planning requiring him to fully comprehend the terms and implications of any agreement before accepting assistance that could prove to have unexpected complications or hidden obligations that might affect his family's future financial stability. "You're saying that Sofia's entire surgical procedure, including pre-operative evaluation, the surgery itself, post-operative care, and any follow-up treatment she might need would be covered through charitable programs that wouldn't require any payment from our family either now or in the future. His question was specific and comprehensive, seeking confirmation that Elena's offer encompassed all aspects of Sofia's medical needs rather than partial coverage that might still leave them facing substantial expenses. Elena nodded confidently at his request for clarification, her professional demeanor conveying both authority to make such commitments and genuine satisfaction in being able to provide a complete solution to their medical and financial crisis, rather than merely offering sympathy or partial assistance that wouldn't adequately address Sofia's treatment needs. "That's exactly what I'm offering," she confirmed, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from years of experience, making important decisions about patient care and resource allocation within major medical institutions. Sofia's complete surgical care would be covered through a combination of our hospital's charitable care fund and private foundation grants that I have discretionary authority to approve for cases involving pediatric cardiac surgery where families face financial barriers to accessing timely treatment. The specificity of Elena's explanation helped Marcus understand that her offer was grounded in legitimate institutional resources rather than personal charity or informal arrangements that might prove unreliable or subject to change based on administrative decisions beyond her control. Though he remained amazed by the scope of what she was proposing and the speed with which she was prepared to implement a solution to problems that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. "How is this possible?" he asked, his curiosity about the mechanisms behind Elena's offer overcoming his initial focus on simply accepting assistance that could save Sofia's life and secure her access to optimal medical care. "I mean, $60,000 is a substantial amount of money, and I can't imagine that hospitals routinely have that kind of discretionary funding available for individual cases, especially when the need is identified through chance encounters in parking lots rather than formal application processes." Elena's expression became more thoughtful as she considered how to explain the complex web of institutional resources, private philanthropy, and professional relationships that made her offer possible while maintaining appropriate confidentiality about financial arrangements that involved multiple organizations and funding sources. Children's Memorial Hospital maintains several charitable care funds that are specifically designated for pediatric cardiac surgery cases where families face financial hardship, she explained, her response providing insight into institutional policies and procedures that weren't widely publicized or easily accessible through standard financial counseling channels. These funds are supported by private donations, foundation grants, and hospital resources that are allocated specifically for cases where cost considerations might delay or prevent access to medically necessary treatment for children whose conditions require specialized care. Her explanation about dedicated charitable care funds suggested that Marcus's family was not unique in facing financial barriers to pediatric cardiac surgery, though the existence of such resources raised questions about why the hospital's financial counselor hadn't mentioned these options during their consultation earlier in the evening. If these charitable care funds exist and are intended for situations like ours, why wasn't this option discussed during my meeting with the financial counselor? Marcus asked, his confusion about the evening's consultation mixing with gratitude for Elena's intervention while wondering whether other families in similar circumstances were also unaware of assistance programs that could address their medical financing needs. Patricia Chun seemed knowledgeable about available options, but she never mentioned discretionary funds or foundation grants that might cover Sofia's surgical costs. Elena sighed softly at his question, her expression revealing frustration with institutional procedures that sometimes created barriers between families in need and available resources due to administrative complexity and inadequate communication between different departments within large medical institutions. The reality is that our financial counseling staff often focuses on standard insurance processing and payment plan arrangements rather than exploring the full range of charitable care options that might be available for specific cases. She admitted her candor about institutional limitations, providing context for the confusion and missed opportunities that characterized many families' experiences with healthcare financing. The discretionary funds that I can approve are typically reserved for cases where medical professionals identify specific patients whose treatment needs align with foundation grant criteria and institutional charitable care guidelines. Her admission about limitations in standard financial counseling procedures helped Marcus understand why Elena's intervention was necessary to access resources that theoretically existed but weren't routinely offered to families facing similar financial crises. Though it also raised concerns about how many other families might be denied access to available assistance due to administrative oversights or inadequate coordination between medical and financial staff. So Sofia's case would need your personal approval and intervention to access these charitable care funds, he asked, seeking confirmation that Elena's professional position and institutional authority were essential components of the solution she was proposing rather than resources that might be available through alternative channels if he knew how to navigate the system more effectively. That's correct, Elena confirmed, her response acknowledging both the reality of institutional hierarchies and her willingness to use her professional authority to ensure that Sofia received appropriate care without financial barriers that could compromise her health outcomes. My position as chief of pediatric cardiac surgery includes discretionary authority over certain charitable care funds and foundation grants that are specifically designated for complex congenital heart cases where delayed treatment could result in increased surgical risk or reduced effectiveness of intervention. Her explanation clarified that her offer was both legitimate and sustainable, grounded in institutional policies rather than personal charity that might prove unreliable or subject to change based on circumstances beyond her control. The realization that Elena's professional position provided her with both the medical expertise to treat Sofia's condition and the institutional authority to remove financial barriers to her care created a sense of completeness to the solution she was offering that exceeded anything Marcus had imagined possible when he had begun exploring treatment options months earlier. What would be required from our family to proceed with this arrangement? He asked, shifting his focus from understanding Elena's offer to practical considerations about implementation and scheduling that would determine how quickly Sofia could receive the surgery that her condition required. Are there applications or documentation requirements that need to be completed before Sofia can be scheduled for surgery? And how long would that process typically take? Elena's response was immediate and practical, reflecting her experience with expediting care for pediatric patients whose conditions required prompt intervention to achieve optimal outcomes. Maria Santos, my office administrator, will handle all the necessary paperwork and documentation for the charitable care approval, she explained, her systematic approach to implementation providing reassurance that Sofia's case would be managed efficiently rather than becoming entangled in bureaucratic delays that could compromise her treatment timeline. She also coordinated with our surgical scheduling team to arrange Sofia's preoperative evaluation and surgery as quickly as possible, probably within the next 2 weeks depending on our operating room availability and Sofia's current condition. The timeline that Elena proposed was dramatically faster than anything Marcus had anticipated, based on his previous experiences with medical scheduling and insurance authorization processes. The possibility that Sofia could receive surgery within 2 weeks representing a complete transformation of their family's medical trajectory and eliminating the anxiety about delayed treatment that had been compromising his sleep and mental health for months. 2 weeks seems incredibly fast compared to the timeframes I've been hearing from other medical offices, he observed, his gratitude for Elena's intervention mixing with amazement at her ability to circumvent the administrative obstacles that had been creating delays in Sofia's access to treatment. Is this typical for emergency cases? Or is Sofia receiving special consideration because of our parking lot encounter and your personal involvement in arranging her care? Sofia's case would qualify for expedited scheduling based purely on medical criteria, regardless of how we met. Elena replied, her professional assessment providing reassurance that their chance encounter hadn't influenced her clinical judgment about Sofia's treatment needs or the urgency of surgical intervention. Congenital heart defects that are progressing require prompt surgical repair to prevent complications that could increase operative risk or compromise long-term outcomes. So expedited scheduling is medically appropriate rather than special treatment based on personal circumstances. Her explanation confirmed that Sofia's surgical timeline would be determined by medical necessity rather than favoritism, though Elena's personal involvement would certainly ensure that scheduling proceeded efficiently without administrative delays. The conversation was approaching a natural conclusion as Elena provided Marcus with specific instructions about contacting her office and beginning the process of arranging Sofia's surgery. Though he found himself struggling to express adequate gratitude for assistance that would fundamentally change his daughter's life while resolving their family's most pressing financial crisis. "I don't know how to thank you for what you're offering," he said, his voice reflecting emotion that he was trying to control while recognizing that professional gratitude was inadequate for expressing his appreciation for Elena's willingness to intervene in their desperate circumstances. This evening started with what felt like impossible financial news, and you're offering a solution that addresses every concern I've had about Sofia's access to treatment and our family's ability to afford the care she needs. Elena's response reflected both professional satisfaction in being able to help a family in need and personal fulfillment that came from using her institutional authority to address systemic problems that prevented children from accessing necessary medical care due to financial considerations beyond their family's control. "This is exactly why I chose pediatric cardiac surgery as my specialty," she said, her voice conveying genuine enthusiasm for work that combined technical medical challenges with opportunities to make dramatic differences in children's lives and their families' futures. Being able to repair congenital heart defects and restore normal cardiac function is rewarding enough, but being able to remove financial barriers that might prevent children from accessing optimal care makes the work even more meaningful. Her comment about removing financial barriers suggested that Elena's intervention in Sofia's case was part of a broader commitment to addressing healthcare accessibility issues that affected multiple families rather than an isolated act of charity motivated by their chance parking lot encounter. Though Marcus recognized that their family was extraordinarily fortunate to have connected with someone whose professional position provided both medical expertise and institutional resources necessary to resolve their crisis. Sofia is incredibly lucky that her potential surgeon happened to be in the hospital parking lot when my tire went flat, he observed, his appreciation for the coincidental timing of their meeting mixing with awareness that other families facing similar circumstances might not have access to the same level of professional intervention and institutional support. "Maybe it wasn't entirely coincidental," Elena replied with a slight smile that suggested she was comfortable with the possibility that their meeting represented something more than random chance, though she didn't elaborate on whether she believed in fate, destiny, or simply the statistical likelihood that spending enough time in hospital environments would eventually result in encounters with families facing medical crises that could benefit from professional intervention. Regardless of how we met, what matters now is ensuring that Sofia receives the surgical care she needs as quickly and efficiently as possible, and that your family can focus on supporting her recovery rather than worrying about financial obligations that would create additional stress during an already challenging time. As their conversation concluded with final details about contacting Elena's office and beginning Sofia's preoperative evaluation process, Marcus found himself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions that ranged from profound gratitude and relief to lingering disbelief that their family's desperate situation had been resolved through a chance encounter that seemed too fortunate to be entirely real. The transformation from financial desperation to comprehensive medical care coverage represented such a dramatic change in their circumstances that he suspected it would take days or weeks to fully process the implications of Elena's offer and adjust his thinking from crisis management to optimistic planning for Sofia's surgery and recovery. The business card and contact information that Elena had provided represented more than mere medical referrals. They constituted a complete solution to problems that had seemed insurmountable and a pathway to Sofia's recovery that eliminated every obstacle that had been preventing her from accessing optimal care for her congenital heart condition.